Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm so excited today to have Ryan George with us. Ryan, thank you so much for taking the time.
Oh, man, I'm stoked to have this conversation with you.
I love to kind of start with the macro. You have obviously done a ton of stuff with ministry and speaking and author. And so from a big picture perspective, how would you describe the calling that God has placed on your life?
Yeah, so I really like to connect for people the idea of faith and adventure, to call them into adventure. The first step of that is often having to convince them that they're safe in a faith environment. And so it's a two-part thing. One is to help people feel welcome and safe. And ministries that I've worked in over the years to help people who are asking questions or checking out God or maybe have some church hurt to feel safe around people of faith. And then it's to take them from there to dare them to do great things with and for God.
I love the way that you talk about adventure. I'm curious if maybe it would be helpful for the podcast family, for you and I to kind of get a working definition of how do you define what adventure is? Because I've been all over your Instagram and your website. You do some crazy stuff, and people are like, I know that someone's like going to Google you and be like, I'm not doing that. So what does adventure mean, like in your world?
It's leaning into your fear and doing it anyway. And so my wife is way more relationally adventurous than I am, right? She's willing to say harder things to people than I am. My brother is willing to eat food more adventurous than I am. There's all different. I know people who are vocationally more adventurous. I come from a line of entrepreneurs. I have one of my cousins was worth like $50 million by the age of 28 because of 4.coms he started. I just don't have that type of adventure in me. So what I like to do is call out the adventure in all of us. We all have something in the back of our head that we would love to know what that feels like, but we're too scared to try. And that could be faith. It could be academic. It could be any number of things. And so my pastor, one of my pastors, was a former wilderness guide, and he was trained to take people into the wilderness and get them to try rock climbing for the first time or whitewater paddling or ice climbing. And then when they would get done, he would leave them with a journal and a pencil and say, okay, what is something back home that you thought I can't or I would never, that you're scared of, that now you know that's an arbitrary line? What are you going to do when you go home now that you know that this is all arbitrary? And so then he carried that into the faith space, which is where I picked up on it, to go, all right, what are the things I'm scared to say yes to Jesus or the Holy Spirit or however you frame it, that now you know that that's an arbitrary line. Let's go do it. And so we pray courage over each other. We dare, not to do stupid things, not to do harmful things, but to go, hey, if you knew that that's the only thing holding you back is fear, why don't you lean into it? And what I've learned now as an adrenaline junkie is that the more scared I am, the better the rush. The first time I went bungee jumping, I jumped 439 feet out of a glass cable car. And the guy asked me, he's like, how you doing, mate? And it was in New Zealand. And I said, man, I'm scared. I used some colorful language. He said, that's good, mate. He said, you'll have a better ride. When I go to jump, I don't get anything out of it anymore because I do this every day. And so what happens in action sports is that you have to keep pushing the envelope. You have to keep running the edge. It's why the guys who do base jumping and like wingsuit flying, whatever, have such a high mortality rate. To get that same feeling, you have to take bigger and bigger risks. And so what I've learned is rather than pursue that on the physical side, I keep trying to go bigger and bigger risks, bigger and bigger fears on the faith and relational side of my life to scratch that itch.
I think you got a lot of people reeling right now. Like, what's adventure look like in my life? So let me just ask you, let me get super practical.
Sure.
On a random Tuesday in April, what does relational adventure look like for you?
I'll give you one that happened last night. I mean, I was, your stomach knots up and you're like, one of my really close friends said, I'm thinking about leaving the faith. Like, I believe in the whole God thing, but I just don't, like everything else that comes after that, I'm not in it. And my world, like all my to-do lists, everything became peripheral for the moment to answer that text, right? To go, oh, this is going to be hard. Like, this is one of my closest friends. How do I share the hope that lies within me? I've had all kinds of them. This sounds really stupid, but when I was writing my book, I was in a cafe in a city 3 time zones from here, a godless city. It's famous for not having a lot of Christians in it. And I got this prompt to leave this monster tip, like a 50, 60% tip, and write, Jesus loves you on the receipt and walk out. And my heart was racing. I was like, this guy's how's he going to make that connection? But that was the assignment. And what I've learned is that if I don't take this assignment, I may not get the next one, or it may be longer or maybe smaller. It may not be as big of an adventure. Pastor Erwin McManus in Los Angeles has a saying that I like. He says, when we say yes to God, his voice becomes louder and clearer, louder and clearer. And when we say no, it gets fainter and fainter, to the point that maybe someday we even forget that we ever heard that voice, or maybe not recognize it as easily. And so when I have this moment to say the hard thing to a friend, to send a text, it can be, for me, again, relational challenges are as scary as jumping off a building, to say, hey, you need to reach out to this person. That's a regular occurrence in my life. And unfortunately, as I've said, yes, I'm getting more of those assignments.
How do you know when it's God's voice and not just what you want to say or do? Like, what's the discerning factor for you on, yes, that thus saith the Lord, or thus saith Ryan?
Well, I'll follow an example of Jesus. The things that he called his disciples to were countercultural and counter-normative for their religious experience. And so for me, if it looks like a churchy thing to do, it might not be God. It might just be my ego. If someone's going to tag me in a post about it later on Facebook, it might be for my ego. So I look at it and go, am I being called away from my ego and away from affirmation and away from a transactional reward, right? Now, there is a spiritual reward for sure, and you felt that. But we all know you can kind of do both, right? Like, you can say you're doing something for God and get up on a stage and get people to clap. And you say, oh, God called me to say this to you. It's way harder for me to do that in a closed group text that no one's ever going to see, right? And so for me, is this hard for me? One, because God's going to keep calling me to hard things. And is he in it? And is this more about what he gets out of the deal, or more what I get out of the deal?
How do you stay salty on that, right? Like, how do you what are some of the disciplines that you do on a regular basis that kind of help you lean into that perspective? Because I think most of the leaders I talk to, no one ever wakes up one day and says, man, today is the day I want to get complacent about my faith or my marriage or my leadership. Instead, what we do is we just naturally drift, and when I was in the Army, we call it mission drift, right? Like, how do you avoid mission drift when it comes to your faith?
Well, accountability is a big part. So I'm in a Bible study every Wednesday night with a group of guys. We sit outside. So my primary spiritual pathway is nature. So most of my prayers happen outside. Most of my spiritual community actually happens outside. We sit around a fire, or in the summertime, picnic tables, and we challenge each other. Hey, what can I pray for you this week? What are your conversations with God look like right now? What do your conversations with your wife look like right now? What are the hard things you're facing with your kids? And over the next 7 days, what's the practical thing we can pray over your life, right? And so what happens is I know next Wednesday night, there's a really good chance I'm going to get asked by the guy who prayed for me, hey, how'd that go, right? This past Sunday, my pastor was speaking about contentment. And this final question, so our church isn't in rows, it's in tables on Sunday mornings. And so he kind of sets it up and turns it over the tables. He said, all right, your last question to the table is about contentment. What are you going to do to foster contentment in your life this week? Not big grand scheme, this week. And I intentionally told a guy that I ride motorcycles with, that I pray with on a regular basis. It was him that I went to and said, this is what I'm going to do to foster contentment in my life this week, these 7 days. And so there's an accountability piece there. And the other factor is that in my spiritual communities, it's not like a pyramid. There's no leader. Everything's a circle, particularly my Wednesday night group, which I founded it. I'm the guy who sends out the group text. I'm the one who picks what we read and all that kind of stuff. But there's no teaching. And so the egalitarian part of it doesn't let me get too big for my britches and makes me have to, if I'm going to influence others to chase after Jesus, that has to permeate my daily experience so that I have something contagious to share with the group.
Your perspective on church is refreshing and beautiful, especially considering all the things that you've been through. In your latest piece of writing, Hurt and Healed by the Church, you start with talking about the independent fundamental Baptist church that you were kind of a part of, and the cult, and just your father's role and all that. kind of hopeful if you could give us a background, kind of the Genesis story of how that came to be. When did you realize that you were in an unsafe place?
I don't know that I realized it was unsafe until after I left. Right? Like I didn't know it until I felt a safe place. Does that make sense? Like you go, oh, what I had before wasn't safe. I remember the first time. So I came to the church that I attend now. I've attended for the last 18 years. My wife's on staff there. I serve there every Sunday. I came there to prove it wrong because it was different than the tradition that I had grown up in. And I remember right after I started going there, they had this environment. They're like, hey, if you'd like to study what the church should look like, we're going to have this 8-week thing, and we're just going to dive into what should church look like. And I remember I got in this circle, again, another circle, right? There's nobody teaching. And the couple who was like moderating the circle were going through infertility issues. And they were just on the precipice of having to go to IVF. They're like, we've exhausted every other thing we could do, but we don't have money for IVF, but we really want to be parents. And we're really having a hard time believing that God is good right now. And I'd never heard anybody say that out loud in a church, right? Let alone like as the leader of the environment. And you go, oh, we're allowed to say that kind of stuff around here? So it became normal. And everybody that I met was like that. We have a policy on our teaching team. So we have men and women that meet during the week to determine what gets said on stage. But who they determine says the thing on stage is based on who has wrestled with that the most. So 3 weeks ago, we did a talk, a discussion on what does it look like to be a non-anxious presence in an anxious world? Because that will be a salt and light type difference, right? And the guy that they had speak that Sunday was a guy who'd been hospitalized for panic attacks.
Wow.
He said, this is how I've learned to find the peace of Jesus in my life as someone who had, traumatic physical anxiety on top of all the other stuff. And so it's become normative for me to be in environments where the person in the front of the room or at the head of the table or whatever says, it's safe enough to admit this because I'm going to go first. We have a saying in our church all the time is give people the gift of going second. And so I've done that in every environment. I was bullied as a kid. You've read my book. I was bullied by my dad. To be in environments where people feel unbullied, that's the best word I have for it, is be like, no, you can share whatever, which is why I got that text last night, right? To go, no, Ryan's safe for me to share that. And so then after I've experienced that, I was able to then look back at the various things of my youth and go, that was so off. That was because Jesus radiated that safety. Religious leaders, secular leaders, soldiers, poor people, lepers, everybody felt safe around him, wanted more of his attention and his presence. And it didn't matter where they came from, their age, their gender, their national, everybody felt safe and seen by Jesus, which is my experience now with him. And so now what I try to do is communicate to other people how to have that. And in that process, I've seen that I had a shocking lack of that growing up.
Having an abusive father really impacts the way that you see the world, particularly impacts the way that you see God, the Father. Talk to us a little bit about that process. I imagine that there's somebody listening right now who really struggles with their dad, if not hates, right? Like there's a leader out there and he or she is like, I just can't with my dad. Every time I talk to him, he's not there. He's just, he's painful. Can you talk us through that reconciliation process in your life in terms of how you got good with God?
Yeah. So I would say based on the different sermons I've heard online that a lot of pastors struggle with that, to be first. I can't remember who the psychologist was. It's a Christian psychologist. It's working on a theory. I think it's going to become a book eventually. But he or she, I heard on a podcast, and they were talking about you can tell what family wounds a Christian has by who they pray to. So if you've ever been in a circle and you hear someone pray to the Father all the time, well, they probably had a really good experience with their dad. If they pray to Jesus all the time, well, they probably got some wounds from their dad, right? So one of the things I noticed is all the time I was talking to Jesus. And when I heard that, it was like a nickel drop. I was like, oh, I got some stuff I need to work on here. It was really hard for me to listen to like Chris Tomlin's good father, right? Like to go, I don't necessarily feel that. The God I grew up with was very superstitious. But what I did was instead I leaned into, all right, so if that's true, can I lean into the other 2/3 of the Trinity? Can I lean into the comforter part? Can I lean into the Son who was wounded for our transgressions? And I started narrowing even what the amount of scripture I read that was just the Gospels over and over and over again. And I fell in love with Jesus as a winsome person. It's like everybody was drawn to this guy, and I felt I was too. And so as I fell in love with Jesus, I realized, I need to work on this. So one of the things I did is I got into therapy. I got into different accountability groups. I made friends with guys who were incredible fathers. The guys in my Bible study group range from age 17 to 80. And right now we got an 80-year-old and two 70-year-olds. And I just love soaking in their kindness. The way that they pray for their children is so different than how my dad prayed over me, right? And it's made me more comfortable to talk to God as a father. And then I think the biggest thing that changed was I was trying not to be a dad. I didn't know if I'd be like my dad. And so I had all 3 versions of a vasectomy to make sure it wouldn't happen. And I was on a helicopter expedition up in British Columbia. We were stand-up paddleboarding up in the glaciers. And I get back to civilization. I had a text from my wife saying, hey, by the way, a young lady's been put in our protective care. She was in my inner city Bible study group, and we're just going to take care of her for a little bit. Fast forward 4 years later, she's my legal daughter. I went to see her in college the other night. But as I pursue and let that go and pursued, I was like, well, if I'm going to be a dad, just like everything else in my life, I'm going to go all in, and I'm going to, just like with business or ministry or whatever. And as I leaned into fatherhood, I was like, oh, this is what fatherhood's supposed to feel like, what it's supposed to look like. And I started to feel pursued by my heavenly Father, not just Jesus and the Holy Spirit. And I remember where I could take you there right now. I was hiking up in the mountains up here about 6 miles from my house. And I can tell you this spot in the dirt where I just started crying and calling God Father. And I think that broke. And so now I think I have a more, I wouldn't say it's equal across the Trinity, but I have more of a relationship with the Father side of it than I've ever had.
I think one of the interesting parts about this journey for you is the idea about hierarchical structures, right? And leadership and roles that people play. A lot of my podcast family are leading people. Some of them are Christians, some of them are non-Christians in terms of who they're leading. If someone were to come to you and say, Ryan, what's your best leadership advice so that we don't slip into abusive patterns, intentionally or unintentionally? What's some of your responses around that?
I would try to pursue the reputation of a good listener, because if you're a good listener and you can make people feel safe, it's less likely that you're going to abuse that person. Now, you can abuse anything. You can take advantage of any relational opportunity. But I remember there's so much insecurity built up in me. One of the reasons I went around to all 7 continents in both polar circles, jumping off of everything, was to try to prove to the world that I was worthy and that I was interesting. I thought if I was interesting enough, people would want me in their circles. But what I've learned over time through counseling, through reading, whatever, is that what makes people invite me into their circles is if I'm interested in them, right? When they know their story matters and it's important, that I'm not there just to share my brand, that I'm not on social media just to share my story, that I am there to take them in, to hear it. Now, sometimes I'll tell you it's super hard because some people are boring and some people are annoying. But the pastors in my life, the mentors in my life who were compassionate listeners, man, the impact then when they would just ask us simple questions like, so what does that mean for you and God then? I could wrestle with bigger things because, again, I felt seen and heard and welcomed into that space. And so if you are known as a good listener, a good making space for people, letting people feel seen, I think you go a long ways. It pushes you further and further away from the abusive end of the spectrum.
Jumping back into your story, how did you know when it was time to leave? Right? You mentioned that you didn't know it was safe, but obviously there was a catalyst kind of event there that that caused you to leave. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit of that with with us? What prompted movement?
So it was a two-parter, and they both have to do with my wife. So I can tell you that story. I believe I have permission for all of this. We were out in Indiana. That's where I moved right after college, took my first job. And I had moved her into a church just like the one I grew up in. And my wife did not grow up in that at all. And spiritually, like, her battery level was just dropping. There weren't people her age. The messaging coming from the front of the room was just not good. And so when I started my business out here in Virginia, we moved out here. I said, I tell you what, I owe you one. I'll let you pick the church. Well, my wife had grown up in Bolivia. She's a translator. She takes groups down to different South American countries, missions organizations, etc. And so she picked a Spanish-speaking church. She was on the worship team, singing in Spanish, whatever. My Spanish is horrible. So after 2-3 years of that, I said, babe, my battery now is off. Like, I could feel I'm swearing more. I'm not, like, I'm telling dirtier jokes. Like, there was just, the barometer was off. And she's like, all right, well, why don't you find a church, because the Latin church meets later in the day because of the culture. Find a church that has an early service to start going there. And that was the one that I've been going to for 18 years. After a month of me going there, she came to that church because, like, everyone saw the difference in me. I had friends that moved from other states that moved into our area. They're like, Ryan, you're a different person than you were a year ago. And it's just because both me and my wife got to a spot where we were both in a church that was, filling our cup or recharging our batteries or what have you. But my wife's boldness to say, hey, what we're hearing is not good. It's not healthy. She likes to speak truth to power. And our first date, I asked her, I said, if you came with a warning label, what would it be? And she said, be real with me and everything will be okay with you. And she's proven that to be true. Like, even when truth is hard to say to her, she welcomes that. And she'd much rather me say the hard thing than to not say anything for 6 weeks and then bring it up later, And so that became normative. The only tattoo she had for like 10, 12 years was the Japanese symbol for truth. And she set in me this idea of, hey, the stuff that you were taught growing up is not the truth. And she didn't tell me what was. She just said, I think you need to explore that. And I have. And I've been in relationships with other explorers. And she's a voracious reader, and that became contagious. Now I'm taking in a bunch of books. And so I'm a naturally curious person, but I wasn't curious about my faith until after we got married and moved away from fundamentalism. And still to this day, my wife and I don't agree on everything on a theological perspective, but we both respect each other's curiosity, and we fan the flames of that curiosity.
I'm always curious when I hear somebody who married somebody who's outside of their normal realm of existence, right? Because, growing up, you were in this kind of cocoon environment where it was very different. How did you and your wife meet? How did you know, like, she was it? Like, give me the love story, spare no detail.
Well, so her parents are missionaries and didn't have money to, send her to a big name school. And they didn't have a home back here in the States where she could stay in the summertime. So they sent her to the college that I went to, which was a fundamentalist college, because they had a program there where you could live year round. They had a lot of international students. And so she went from a non-fundamentalism type, still conservative faith, but very different from what I grew up in. And then she was stuck in this place for 4 years and worked there year round until we got married. And so just normal dating, she chafed under it. I chafed under it too, but for different reasons. She chafed under it from this isn't right. And I chafed under it because I'm just tired of this, is more of a wearing down type thing. So, I just decided there's something different about this girl, and I'm going to put a ring on it. And I worked at a summer camp one summer, and we had a bunch of pretty young college co-eds, and I flirted. I wasn't wearing a ring yet. My wife, but she and I were only dating for a few months. And at the end of the summer, I was like, you know what? No, I think I have the real deal back home or back at school, And so I came home, saved up, got a ring, and put a ring on it. And then we were very fortunate when we moved to Indiana because we had no family there, really. I had some extended family about a half hour away, but we didn't have a lot of the trappings that a lot of other couples had. We didn't have either set of parents nearby. We didn't have a pre-existing friend group. And so it forced us into this extreme focus on our marriage because we were all each other had for 2 years for the most part. And that built a really good foundation to where we knew each other inside. We didn't even have a TV the first year. Part of that was the fundamentalism I was growing up in. And so we just had to learn each other. Like each other was all we had. And then what was cool is when we moved out here to Virginia, we both have very different friend groups. There's some Venn diagram overlap, obviously, but like her community and my community are two very, very different communities. Nobody in her group uses the word dude, and everybody in mine does, you know? But yeah, so it created this base layer if we actually knew each other really, really well. And so then as I was changing in my faith and as she was changing in her faith, we trusted the underlying foundation underneath that to go, hey, even though you're changing, and I may not be comfortable with all the changes, I love the you underneath because that's all I had, you know, when we started.
That's beautiful. One of the things that I'm always curious about when somebody writes a book that's so personal and so vulnerable is what paradigm do you use on when it's safe emotionally and spiritually to share a story that's as painful as what you share in this writing?
That's a really good question. When I was writing my last book, I went to a writer's seminar for Christian authors down in Houston, and Beth Moore was there. And I don't remember the exact graph, but she put it up on the screen and she says, write about your pain while you're going through it. Write a lot, you know, journal, whatever. And then get help, you know, talk to mentors, talk to counselors, talk to pastors, work through that and practice telling your story in more and more detail to wider and wider circles. You need to be able to go back to those journals to remember the raw part. Because now I tell the story of all the stuff my dad did to me, what he did to girls and women. And it can be a whole lot easier for me than it is the other side of the screen or the other side of the conversation. So I have to put myself back in those original journal entries from however many years ago. But she said, once you get healthy, tell the story because there are other people with your story. And if you can tell it without an agenda, right? If you're not trying to get your pound of flesh, like if you're on a healthier spot. This past Sunday, I was talking to one of my buddies, very much abused by his father growing up. And he said, you know what? People who are recovered and who are healthy don't have to tell you that they are. The people who tell you I'm recovered probably aren't yet. And so once you get to a spot where you feel internally and you're getting affirmation from other, so people were coming up to me and saying, Ryan, you've changed so much. Some of my closest friends said, Ryan, you used to be like this, but now you're like this. My sister said, Ryan, you used to be the most, like she was honest about it. She's like, 5 years ago, you were like this. This was the trajectory of your life, and it isn't now. My wife used to say, you're just like your dad, which was like the worst thing she could say. And 5 years ago, she told me, she's like, Ryan, you are nothing like your dad.
Praise
and so
God, yeah.
when I got to those kind of places and realizations, whether in a counselor's office or a pastor or whatever, I went, I think I'm ready to tell this story in a way that'll give other people, again, that feeling of safety to tell their own story. Whether that's remotely through a reader or, you know, in a Zoom call or what have you. And part of it was one of my dad's victims has a 2-hour-long YouTube interview detailing all the things he did to her. And so the story went public on its own. Like my dad, I learned on a podcast that my dad was a serial predator, right? And went, oh, well, now this story's out. Can I tell the redemptive side of it? Can I talk about what can happen on the other side of that pain? We don't hear a lot of biographies from the children of people in the news or the wife of people in the news. But Jesus has redeemed all of that pain in beautiful ways in my life and in the lives around me. Can I encourage people? Because that book's not out there. Like the amount of podcasts that I'm on right now from deconstructionists, people who are walking away and throwing it all away, including former pastors. I was on a podcast a couple weeks ago, and it was a former seminary professor who's completely walked away from church and God and everything else. That's what people expect after those kind of stories. And Jesus has done something very different in my life. And if I don't share it with people, I'm not allowing the redemption to reach its full arc, its full potential.
When you think about fundamentalism today, obviously you've done so much work. You've done a lot of healing. You've been through the ringer on so much of it. How would you describe your relationship to fundamentalism, and maybe even more importantly than that, to someone who still calls that their church home?
There's greater and greater distance personally for me from what I believe and experience and express with God now than what I used to. And that distance is only getting further and further apart. That is the model of the book, right? That is the way that I built the book. It says unsaved churches used to tell me this, or show me this, or teach me this, but Jesus. And this is what I've learned about that since. And I do that over and over and over.
Right.
Every chapter starts that way in the book. As far as people in it, I've been recently asked, like, can you convince somebody that they're in a cult? Can you convince somebody intellectually that what they believe is harmful or unsafe? And I have not. I have family members who are still in. My parents are still in. I have extended family members who are, and there's no debating someone out of a cult. That's not how cults work. For the family members who've gotten out, my friends who've gotten out, the way out is through love. Do they feel safe, right? So many cults say, hey, you got to be scared of what's out there. And if you look out there, we're going to shun you to where you're forced out there. It's a binary choice. And the stories of shunning in cults, especially IFB churches, is just horrific. So if you're someone standing on the other side of that glass wall, or however you want to describe it, with open arms, saying, when you get over here, give me a hug. Let's go on vacation. And so I've taken former fundamentalists on vacation. I'll take him hiking. I'll take him camping. We'll go out, wherever. And you let them feel safe. And you don't start with, hey, what you believe is wrong. What you show them is what is right. Like, you live it out. If you are living the life and example of Jesus, that will be the attraction, right? And then that leads to questions. And it's not like a bait and switch thing, but that's how Jesus got people out of the cult of his day, right? Like, that's how he got people away from all the different things. Their sin, their shame, their cultural, the woman at the well was loving him. And so if there's love waiting on the other side, it makes it easier then to look back. And that's what my wife did to me. That's what my mentors did to me, is they kept showing me a better way. And then you turn around and you look at what you used to have and go, why would I ever? And so if someone a fundamentalist watching this, I don't think that they're going to buy anything that we're saying, but hopefully that there's somebody in their life that they can look to, so that person has the real deal and I want to know them better. And then maybe eventually they'll want to know Jesus better. One of the ways I joked, a podcaster gave me this analogy. She's like, nobody goes to a Taylor Swift concert and comes home alone. Everybody's a fan of Taylor Swift, whether they go with a group or not. On the way home, they got friendship bracelets, right? They have new friends on Instagram. It's the same. Like, there's a couple podcasts that I listen to. I've been fans for over a decade, and I go to the meetups, and nobody from my town listens to them. But I go there and I make friends, and I come home, and it's the same way when I left fundamentalism. When I found the Jesus that everybody was so attracted to in the Gospels, I start to find other people who want to know that Jesus, and we kind of become a posse running together.
I love that. A year from now, what are we celebrating about what God has done through you and your ministry?
Oh, well, that's two different questions. So one is through the book, and I just hope a whole bunch of people feel seen and have the courage to tell their story. But my ministry isn't primarily my writing. My primary ministry is the guys who are sending me texts on Monday nights, right? And I don't know if, I don't think that it'll be that there's more guys. I think it'll be that I'm having deeper and deeper and deeper conversations with people than even what I'm having now. That there'll be people. It's interesting that happens almost every Wednesday night. So I'm the one who builds the fire, and I'm the one who has to make sure all the coals are out before we leave the park, because we can't leave a fire going, And every Wednesday night, it's a different dude who's still standing around the fire at 10:30 with me when everybody else has gone home. Everybody has gone through something that week that they need to get off their chest. And maybe they weren't brave enough to tell their picnic table, but they're brave enough to talk to me or somebody else. And so a year from now, I hope I'm still standing around that fire till 10:30, 11, sometimes midnight, with people who feel safe to unburden their heart, whether it's about their faith, their family, or their business or whatever.
That's so good. Okay, I have one more question for you, but before I ask it, I know the podcast family is going to want to connect with you all over the interwebs. Where is the best place to learn all things Ryan and to get connected with you?
Yeah, the epicenter for me is Facebook. Ryan George. I'm facebook.com/Ryan George. But on Instagram, Threads, etc., I'm at Ryplane. That's RYPLANE. And I post there to links to my website, to my blog. Booksbyryan.com is where you can get my book. I write weekly or bi-weekly. We'll see how it goes. Kind of like a devotional thought of something that I'm learning at explorience.org. But all that stuff gets filtered through my Instagram at Ryplane.
That's beautiful. Okay, last question I love to ask people. It's an advice question.
Oh,
Except
wow.
I invite you to go back in time and give yourself one piece of advice. But I get to name the season of life that you're in.
Okay. Wow.
So I want to take you back. I want to take you back to the day that you realized where you were wasn't healthy, right? The you're in a new church with your wife, and you've just kind of you had that Paul kind of moment where the scales fell off your eyes and you can see. If you could go back in time and sit knee to knee with that younger version of yourself and give him one piece of advice about what he's about to go through and what he's kind of experienced, if you could give him one piece of perspective or something to hold on to about the very difficult but important journey, what are you going to tell him?
Ask more questions and talk less. There's a part of therapy, right, that talking it out helps you find it. I'm an external processor, and I can't tell you how many times we get to the big discovery in my therapy session with 2 minutes left on the clock, right? That's just part of who I am. But man, what I have learned over the last year of asking someone a question and then just shutting up and letting them go. This past Sunday, there's a guy here locally I've started to become friends with. He runs the Harley Davidson dealership. I'm not a Harley guy. He looks like what you're thinking a Harley guy should look like, right? And he was talking to me about his recovery journey. And I didn't have the same recovery journey as him. And I just kept asking him questions. And man, the truth bombs. I said, "Can you say that again? Because I want to try to burn that into my memory so I can put it in my journal tonight when I journal." He's like, "Yeah, let me just say it again." And there was so much wisdom I missed. Because as I was learning new things about God, I thought I was constantly an expert. Right? I thought, oh, now that I have this new realization, I know better than all those people. And then a year later, it's like, well, now that I know this, I'm better than the old me and all those people. And to just go, no, man, you don't have it figured out. And I still don't. I'm 46. I still don't have it all figured out. But I'm learning now to ask questions more and to sit back and listen more.
That's so beautiful. Ryan, I just deeply appreciate your vulnerability, and I'm so thankful for your generosity of time today. If there's anything I can do to walk alongside you in future or whatever, just don't hesitate to let me know.
Oh, thanks, man. That's very generous.